Free audio post-production
by alphonic.com.
Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-a-Famille History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis-a-Famille History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. Today, we've got a fantastic episode lined up. Wendy will be sitting down with Teddy Mack, who has a Master of Arts in Linguistics at SOAS University, English Lexified Atlantic Creoles. In this episode, they'll be discussing the St. Vincent Creole. So settle in and let's get into the conversation.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, Teddy Mack, for coming on to the podcast to speak about St. Vincent Creole. So before we start, could I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. My name, as you say, is Teddy Mack. I'm a master's student at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. I did my bachelor's at Robinson College, Cambridge in modern and medieval languages. And now I work on Creoles and Pidgins and contact languages, and with a focus on language planning and policy and some of the more formal aspects of grammar and how they differ from European languages.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And, would you be able to start by telling us, why you chose to study St. Vincent Creole?
Yeah, I chose to study Vincentian Creole because I was born in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I lived there until I was about 6, and then we moved to the UK. And the whole time I thought that I was just speaking English. And then we came to this country and I discovered that, people weren't understanding what I was saying. And I had to learn a whole bunch of new words and ways of expressing myself. And eventually, during my undergrad studies, I started getting some of my translations into English marked down for some of the phrases or the constructions that I was using. And speaking to one of my supervisors, she pointed out that it's because those aren't grammatical in English, but they were grammatical in Vincentian Creole, which kind of sparked my interest there. And it really made me realize that, the thing that I grew up, not speaking in polite company, but speaking with my friends and things, that kind of broken English, as we're so often told, is its own language in its own right, and it's a fully fledged language.
Yes, definitely. And I guess what you said in regards to your deeper connection, like what was the moment, or I guess the experience that really sparked your deeper connection to the language?
I think it was really, in fact, I remember specifically, there was one moment where I'd written something like, he had just a while come home in a translation, and that was underlined as completely wrong. And I was like, so I started asking all of my friends around, like, this is fine, right? And they're like, no, what does that mean? And that made me go down a rabbit hole of like looking into the forums with like other Caribbean people who were asking similar kinds of questions. And then I discovered there was an online Caribbean dictionary that has like a collection of words from different Caribbean islands and what we use them for. So like, because this has been a constant thing where my dad is Jamaican, my mum is Vincentian, and in our family there's often arguments over what the correct term for something is, whether it's a custard apple or a sugar apple, or whether it's your bottom foot or your foot bottom. And so going into all of that stuff, I was like, there's so much to find out here. So when I finished my undergrad studies, I decided I wanted to pivot more towards the linguistic aspect rather than looking at the languages aspect, and turning away from the European languages to look at is kind of these most new languages in the world, Pidgins and Creoles, and kind of shining a light on a thing that's often overlooked or actively discouraged.
No, definitely. And I guess for, some of the listeners who may not be familiar, how would you define Saint Vincent Creole?
So Vincentian Creole is an English lexified Creole language, which means that the majority of its vocabulary comes from English, but it has influence from other what are called substrate languages. And I suppose I should explain Creole languages are natural languages that emerge in contexts where people from diverse ethnocultural and linguistic backgrounds then brought together and form new communities. Creoles are they differ from pidgins, for example, in that Creoles are usually somebody's first language, where pidgins are technically a second language used by multiple speech communities.
Mm.
That's not to say that if a language is called pidgin, that for example, Nigerian pidgin is what, as linguists, we would term a Creole, but often Creoles have names that reflect their history of either being used as an ad hoc means of communication or reflect attitudes in language's history. So Jamaican patois, Nigerian pidgin, Tokpisin, Vincentian Creole is even at home called Vinci dialect or just dialect. But as linguists, we would group all of these as Creoles because of the context of their use as being people's first language and of how they came about.
Okay, perfect. And then I guess, what would be, some of then the major influences of the language, such as, French, English, African language? Would you describe it as a blend or something singular?
Yeah, I definitely say it's a mixed language. As I said, most of the vocabulary comes from English, but then there are influences from French and some Portuguese and grammatical influences and vocabulary influences, in fact, from West African languages like Fula or Wolof and things like that. So, for example, take the English word avocado.
Mm-hmm.
In Vinci, it's zaboka, which comes from the French les avocats, which is the plural, the avocados, but it's been reanalyzed where that z is taken as the part of the actual word. So it's, instead of being les avocats, it was analyzed at some point as les zaboka, and then zaboka has stuck. Or even the word for child in so many Caribbean Creoles, picni.
Mm-hmm.
The scholarship shows that this word comes from Portuguese pequenino, which means like a little one. Or we even have, another one just came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
We have a word for the sleep that, what people call sleep or sleep sand in the corner of your eye when you wake up, call that nyampi, which I think comes from, I can't remember, I don't want to get this wrong, but it comes from one of the West African substrates.
And I guess, going on that, could you share, some everyday phrases in English and then in St. Vincent Creole?
Yeah. So my go-to example is, where are you going? Said to a group of people, we would say, awepa ayago, where you've got kind of wepa being which part, ayo is all of you, and ago are going. You could have as well, like, here's an example that uses, Vincentian Creole has two words for to be, right? So we have de, which is to be in a place, and then which is to be kind of more generally. And so if you say dem de whole day, you have dem de, which is like the day there is the plural marker. So it means like those people. Dem de is those people are or were there. And then whole day is the whole day.
Perfect. And, I wanted to ask, do you personally consider St. Vincent Creole a language in its own right? Why or why not?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it is a language in its own right, and I think it deserves to have recognition as such in St. Vincent. It has its own rules and restrictions that on its grammar that just like English does, it's just that it's a different set of rules. It's used by thousands of people every day to go about their lives, to conduct business, to, connect with people. It has such a cultural richness. I grew up with my granny telling me Anansi stories, and with something that's so important to, I think, the very fabric of being Vincentian deserves to be recognized as such. In our constitution, no, not in our constitution, sorry, in a piece of legislation in the education reform that's been going on in the last 20 or so years, there is a drive to promote Vincentian language. But within that, what you have to unpack is that Vincentian Creole doesn't have any official recognitions, and English is the de facto official language of St. Vincent. So it's kind of it doesn't really gel if you're promoting Vincentian language without supporting Vincentian language.
Exactly, exactly. So I guess there's just not enough groups or an organization to really promote or to really say that this should be an official language and recognized as such.
I have heard that there's been much more clamor for recognition of Vincentian Creole in St. Vincent in the last decades. People are, reclaiming this part of their identity. And I know that I have younger siblings that still live in St. Vincent, and they've been encouraged to, particularly in like drama, put on plays or do songs that are in Creole. And my younger sister, in fact, came home and asked our father, what does this mean? Because she didn't understand, because he has raised his children to not use Creole as it's broken, to try and give them more opportunities, but it then creates this disconnect from their community.
No, definitely. And then I know you mentioned this before, but there are people who see Creole languages as broken English. How do you respond to that? And why is it important to recognize its linguistic richness?
I respond by saying, why is it that European languages can borrow and adapt, but when we, as Caribbean speakers, as speakers from minoritized communities, do the same thing, then it's broken.
Hmm.
It's Spanish evolves from Latin, but Creole is broken English. It's a double standard that doesn't sit right with me. And I think Creoles deserves the recognition that European languages have, as well as fully fledged means of communication. And the thing that gets me is that people say that it's just a dialect of English. But when a Spanish person and a Portuguese speaker can understand each other, they're still able to, have their own languages be recognized as separate entities. But when Jamaican person and an English person can understand each other, then the Jamaican person is just speaking a derivative of English.
No, definitely. I definitely agree with you there. And I know we kind of talked about in terms of, what are the origins of St. Vincent Creole, but can you walk us through a bit of its historical development?
Yeah, of course. So St. Vincent was first kind of colonized by Europeans in the 17th century. The British were the first to lay claim to the island, but the French set up the first kind of colonial settlement in the town of Barreley in the late 1700s. And then over the course of its history, St. Vincent has gone from French colonial rule to British colonial rule, then back to French control, then back to British control through a series of treaties and being ceded from one party to the other, almost as like just a added extra in like the Treaty of Paris. We'll also throw in this island. And obviously there were people on St. Vincent before Europeans got there. The native Caribs, the Garifuna people. And then in I think it was 1796, the British expelled the Garifuna from the island after the Second Carib War, where the chief Joseph Chatoyer was captured and killed, and then the Garifuna people who remained were sent to the island of Roatan, just outside of Honduras. So now there are a lot of natively Vincentian people living in Central America, places like Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and they speak the traditional language of the island, Garifuna, but there aren't that many speakers of it in St. Vincent anymore. So obviously when the British came over, they imported a lot of enslaved Africans to work on the plantations, and English was used as, the language of prestige and of control. Now, this isn't to say that the African inhabitants of St. Vincent at the time didn't have any agency and it wasn't a fact of, they just improperly acquired English. Recent scholarship has shown that there may be a case of increasing some of the difference between standard English and their own speech to kind of obfuscate what they were talking about, to have a language of an in-group that included all of the people on the plantations, but excluded like the overseers and the colonizers. And in that way, they were having an active role in the development of their own language as well. I actually have a quote here from a plantation owner called Mrs. Carmichael in St. Vincent from around the time, who documented some of the speech of her slaves. And she says that on the Sundays that this high nasal bleating can be heard coming from their huts. She's not very kind about their speech, but it is one of the earliest written documents of the Creole existing. And here is a quote from one of the slaves who used to say, "No tease me, missus. Me is one very good N-word. Let me be." And we see there some of the features that still exist today, like using first person me as the subject. And she also doesn't use the copula. She said, "Me one very good N-word," which again is something that English doesn't do, but is perfectly grammatical in Creole today.
Now, and I guess, why, Teddy, are you proud to speak St. Vincent Creole, and what does it mean to you on a personal and cultural level?
For me, it's a connection back to my culture, especially having not lived in St. Vincent for over 20 years now. It's something that makes me feel closer to home. And I am sad, actually, to say that I don't feel as comfortable speaking in Vinci as I do speaking in Spanish or Italian, because, it was discouraged so much. And then moving here, there was not really the opportunity. So sometimes when I speak to older members and try to speak of my family and try to speak in Creole, I've had where they've laughed because it sounds so strange to them, because my command of it isn't, with native fluency. And it's difficult for me to have that reaction sometimes, because, it's like the reason that I don't speak this so well is because it was discouraged and told that it was broken English. I need to speak properly. And now that I'm trying to re-engage with it, I'm kind of like the butt end of a joke, but, it's not going to stop me from trying. And because I'm proud to be Vincentian, I'm proud to have this kind of heritage and this history. And I'm proud to be doing work to, bring attention to our languages.
No, definitely. And then how do you see language playing a role, in preserving Vincentian identity, especially among the younger generations or those in the diaspora?
I think for people in the diaspora especially, it's really important to have, something that ties you back to St. Vincent. And language is just one aspect of many things, whether it's from food and music and all of these things that added together create a Vincentian identity. And I think back in St. Vincent as well, too often there's a lot of importance put on being able to be understood by tourists, whether they come from Europe or America, to the detriment of being proud of who we are as Vincentians.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I understand that, the tourist industry is a huge boon for St. Vincent, but you wouldn't, I think you shouldn't expect a whole people to bend to accommodate people who are just visiting.
Exactly. Yes, definitely. And then, are there current efforts to document, teach, or preserve St. Vincent Creole?
Yeah, there's a lot of really great work being done, especially by a linguist called Paula Prescott. She has done, I think, the most work documenting Vincentian Creole, and she's been a huge inspiration. There's been there was recently during the pandemic, a very short-lived news segment posted on social media called Are We News, it billed itself as like local news in the local dialect, which I was so happy to see, because news is typically the domain of like high prestige language, where in St. Vincent there's usually been a system of diglossia where there's a high language and a low language, and the standard English represents the high language, and then Vincentian Creole is the low language, and it's kind of stigmatized. But to see it lifted into this area of high prestige was really heartening. So I can see very much that there are movements happening back home to lift our language up, and it makes me so proud as a Vincentian and as a linguist.
Yeah, I can imagine, absolutely. And Teddy, what do you hope people take away from this conversation about St. Vincent Creole, especially those who may be reconnecting with their roots?
I hope that people listening to this realize that, if you speak a Creole language, if you speak something called Patois, Pidgin, Creole dialect, your language is valid, your identity is valid, and just as valid as the high prestige European language or whatever other language is that holds that position. I want people to break out of this idea of broken languages, because there's no such thing as a broken language, barring, some kind of mental brain trauma or something. I think we all have a right to be proud of our speech, and we should hold on to it because it's a fundamental part of connecting us together. And there's much more to be gained from lifting each other up than breaking it down and dismissing it.
Definitely. I couldn't agree with you more on that. And how can listeners learn more or follow your work in promoting Vincentian language and culture?
Right now, I'm mostly focused on completing my master's, but I am thinking of posting more things about Vincentian Creole online, or I can be followed at the Teddy Mac on Instagram. And my dissertation, I think, will be published and made available to the public through my university, but I will find out more about that as I progress.
Perfect. And I'll put whatever I can on in the show notes for people. And Teddy, as we close, would you mind closing with a short message or a blessing in St. Vincent Creole?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot here. Well, I feel really shy now, I guess. Me want you to know, for your language real, for your language valid, and for your language is just as real as any other one.
Perfect. What I can. But no, thank you so much. I do appreciate you coming on and talking about this. These are one of the things, I guess, when you grow up in the diaspora, that people want to say that, that this is a broken language, so to speak, and for you to take on whichever the prominent language is wherever you're living. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.
Free audio post-production.
by alphonic.com.